At 38 years old, Rihanna appears to have everything the world once watched her fight to achieve. She is an international superstar, a businesswoman, a fashion icon, and a mother of three. Her songs have crossed generations. Her name has become a global brand, and her influence reaches far beyond music. From the outside, her life can look almost untouchable. But in March 2026, something happened that exposed a frightening truth about fame. Success can buy privacy. It can buy gates, security, cameras, and walls. But sometimes, even all of that is not enough. According to Los Angeles prosecutors, Rihanna, her partner A$AP Rocky, their 3 children, and Rihanna's mother were inside the family's Beverly Hills area property when a woman allegedly opened fire at the property. Authorities later charged the suspect with attempted murder and numerous other felony counts. Miraculously, no one was injured. Think about that for a moment. This was not a concert stage surrounded by thousands of screaming fans. It was not a red carpet packed with photographers. It was not a public appearance where security teams already expected chaos. It was home. The place where fame is supposed to stop at the front gate. The place where children are supposed to feel protected from the outside world. And suddenly, according to prosecutors, gunfire shattered that sense of separation. The case would become even more disturbing as additional details emerged. The woman accused of the shooting pleaded not guilty, and later proceedings were paused while a judge ordered an evaluation of her competency to stand trial. The criminal allegations remain allegations unless proven in court. Yet regardless of how the legal case ultimately concludes, one fact was undeniable. Rihanna's family escaped without physical injury. For millions of fans, that was the most important news. But the incident also raised a deeper question. What happens when you become so famous that the entire world knows your face, your relationships, your children, your businesses, your movements, and sometimes even where you live? For Rihanna, that question carries particular weight. Because long before she became the woman behind Fenty Beauty, long before billionaire headlines and Super Bowl performances, and long before paparazzi followed nearly every chapter of her personal life, she was Robin Rihanna Fenty, a girl from Barbados with an extraordinary voice and an opportunity that would change everything. She could not have known just how completely that opportunity would transform her life. Rihanna was born on February 20th, 1988. By 2026, she had turned 38, nearly 2 decades removed from the teenage newcomer who entered the American music industry and quickly became impossible to ignore. Her rise was astonishingly fast. A young woman from a Caribbean island suddenly found herself performing for enormous audiences, appearing on television, traveling constantly, recording music, posing for magazines, and becoming one of the most recognizable women alive. Then came the hits. Then came the awards. Then came the money. Then came something far more complicated, the loss of anonymity. There is an unusual price attached to becoming famous at that level. Millions of strangers feel as though they know you. Every relationship becomes a headline. Every photograph is analyzed. Every absence becomes a rumor. Every change in appearance inspires speculation. And for Rihanna, public attention has followed almost every stage of adulthood. People have watched her fall in love. They have watched relationships end. They have watched her build companies. They have watched her pregnancies. They have debated her body, her music, her clothes, and even the long wait for another album. After ANTI arrived in 2016, an entire generation of fans began treating the mysterious R9 almost like pop culture mythology. 10 years later, Rihanna still had not released another studio album, although she continued making music and was seen working in a recording studio in 2026. Remarkably, her influence had hardly disappeared. In April 2026, Rihanna became the first woman to surpass 200 million RIA-certified single units, another reminder of the enormous musical legacy she had already created. But achievements like those tell only one side of the story. Behind the numbers is a person whose adult life has unfolded under relentless observation. And the March 2026 shooting incident represented an extreme version of something celebrities rarely discuss in ordinary terms. When attention stops feeling flattering and begins feeling dangerous. There is an irony here that is difficult to ignore. Rihanna spent years building independence. She transformed herself from a teenage singer into someone with enough influence to dictate her own creative and business decisions. She created brands bearing her name. She built a family. She reached a level where she no longer seemed dependent on the traditional machinery of the music business. Yet no amount of independence can completely control what strangers decide to do. That may be the darker side of the Rihanna story. Not that success destroyed her. Not that she secretly lost everything. But that extraordinary success came with vulnerabilities almost impossible for ordinary people to imagine. And this frightening afternoon in 2026 was not the beginning of Rihanna's complicated relationship with fame. To understand how Robyn Fenty became Rihanna, and why strength became such an important part of her public identity, we have to travel thousands of miles away from Los Angeles. Back to Barbados. Back before the mansions. Back before Fenty. Back before Umbrella. Back to the girl who had no idea that one day, hundreds of millions of people would know her name. Because the story of what happened to Rihanna at 38 did not truly begin with gunshots outside a Los Angeles home. It began decades earlier, inside a childhood that was far more complicated than the glamorous life the world would eventually associate with her. And that is where Rihanna's real story begins. Long before Rihanna became a name recognized almost everywhere on Earth, she was simply Robyn. There were no photographers waiting outside. No luxury brands. No stadiums. No billion-dollar business empire. There was only Barbados, a modest home, a complicated family, and a young girl beginning to understand that music could become more than something she loved. Robyn Rihanna Fenty was born in St. Michael, Barbados, on February 20th, 1988, and grew up in Bridgetown with her younger brothers. Her childhood was far removed from the glamorous world she would eventually enter. Rihanna has spoken publicly about serious tension inside her family, including her father Ronald Fenty's struggles with alcohol and drug addiction and the strain this placed on her parents' marriage. Her parents eventually separated when she was a teenager. That history matters, because decades later, people would look at Rihanna and see confidence. They would see the woman who could walk into a room wearing something nobody else would dare to wear. They would see someone who appeared almost impossible to intimidate. But confidence is not always something people are born with. Sometimes it is armor. Sometimes strength begins when a child learns early that the world around her cannot always be controlled. Rihanna has described her mother, Monica Braithwaite, as an exceptionally strong woman. Growing up, she watched the complicated relationship between her parents while also living the ordinary life of a Barbadian schoolgirl. Music offered something different. Music offered escape. She listened to Caribbean sounds around her, but she also admired massive international singers such as Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, and Celine Dion. Long before millions would attempt to imitate Rihanna's voice, Rihanna herself was listening closely to the voices of women who had already conquered the world. There was something almost prophetic about it. She was sitting on a small island, listening to global superstars, without knowing that she would eventually become one of them. At school, Rihanna began singing with friends. She also spent time in Barbados' cadet program, another detail that seems almost unbelievable when placed beside the glamorous image the world later knew. Before the couture gowns and red carpets, there was discipline, school, family responsibility, and an ordinary teenage existence. Then came the encounter that changed everything. American producer Evan Rogers was visiting Barbados when Rihanna received an opportunity to audition for him as part of a group with two classmates. Rogers later remembered being immediately struck by Rihanna's presence. Something about her separated her from the others. It was not yet polished superstar confidence. She did not have years of professional training. She did not have a giant management machine behind her. But she had something that cannot easily be manufactured. Presence. Rogers arranged another meeting and eventually helped Rihanna record demo material in the United States. One of those songs was called Ponder Replay. At the time, it was simply part of a demo. Soon, it would change her life. The recordings eventually reached Def Jam Recordings, where Jay-Z had recently taken a leadership role. Rihanna was invited to New York to audition. Imagine that moment. A teenager from Barbados walking into one of America's most important record companies. Across the room were executives capable of opening a door that millions of aspiring singers would never even get close to. Rihanna later recalled being nervous when she saw Jay-Z before the audition. But when the moment arrived, she performed. And whatever fear existed had to disappear. According to Rihanna's later recollection, the meeting stretched late into the night while lawyers worked on a deal. Def Jam did not want her leaving the building without signing a contract. It sounds like a dream, but dreams can demand something in return. Rihanna was still extraordinarily young. Signing that contract meant stepping away from the life she understood and toward a world she could barely imagine. Barbados was home. Her family was there. Her memories were there. Everything familiar was there. America meant opportunity, but it also meant uncertainty. There was no guarantee that Rihanna would become Rihanna. The music industry is filled with teenagers who were once told they would become stars. Many disappeared. Many recorded one song and were forgotten. Many discovered that talent alone was not enough. Rihanna could easily have become one of them. Instead, Ponder Replay exploded. The song was released in 2005 and climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Suddenly, the teenage girl from Barbados was no longer just someone executives believed might become famous. She was becoming famous in real time. Everything accelerated. Recording. Interviews. Performances. Travel. Photo shoots. New songs. New expectations. There was almost no gradual transition between Robin Fenty, the teenager from Bridgetown, and Rihanna, the international recording artist. That may be one of the most overlooked parts of her story. When the world first met Rihanna, audiences saw a beautiful young singer with an infectious Caribbean-influenced hit. But behind that image was a teenager leaving behind a complicated childhood and entering an industry famous for consuming young stars almost as quickly as it creates them. And Rihanna had no idea how intense the next few years would become. Because Ponder Replay was only the beginning. Soon there would be bigger songs, bigger stages, more money, more attention. And eventually, a song called Umbrella would turn Rihanna from a successful young singer into something far more powerful. A global phenomenon. But becoming one of the most famous women alive would bring consequences she could never have understood when she first walked into that Def Jam audition. And one night, only a few years later, the glamorous story surrounding Rihanna would be shattered by an event so disturbing that the entire world would suddenly see a completely different side of her life. By 2007, Rihanna was no longer simply the promising teenager who had arrived from Barbados with a successful first single. Something had changed. Her image was sharper. Her music was bigger. Her confidence seemed stronger. And the world was about to meet a completely different version of Rihanna. That transformation arrived with Good Girl Gone Bad. The album represented far more than another collection of songs. It marked the moment Rihanna began separating herself from the expectations that had surrounded her during the earliest years of her career. The island-influenced teenager introduced through Ponder Replay was evolving into a global pop figure with a darker, more sophisticated visual identity. Then came Umbrella. The song did not simply become a hit. It became one of the defining records of Rihanna's career. The unforgettable chorus, the dramatic production, and Rihanna's increasingly distinctive voice pushed her into another category of celebrity. Suddenly, she was not competing only with other young newcomers. She was becoming one of the biggest stars in pop music. Umbrella reached audiences around the world and helped transform Rihanna into a recognizable figure far beyond the United States. The song became connected to her identity so strongly that even years later, hearing its opening moments could immediately bring her image to mind. For an artist, that kind of breakthrough can feel like the ultimate reward. But it changes everything. Before massive fame, a singer can still disappear. She can walk through places without everyone knowing her name. She can make mistakes without millions of strangers discussing them. She can experience relationships without watching those relationships become entertainment. After a song like Umbrella, Rihanna was losing that freedom. Everywhere she went, people knew who she was. Photographers followed her. Magazines studied her clothing. Fans analyzed her friendships. Industry observers discussed whether she could keep producing hits. The pressure was no longer simply to succeed. The pressure was to remain enormous. And Rihanna delivered. Songs such as Shut Up and Drive, Don't Stop the Music, and Disturbia helped extend her run of success. Her public image grew more daring, and the young woman who had once seemed carefully introduced by the music industry increasingly appeared to be taking control of her own identity. Her haircut became famous. Her fashion choices were copied. Her performances became more ambitious. The transformation seemed effortless from the outside. But careers at that level are rarely effortless. There are rehearsals audiences never see. Flights taken while exhausted. Interviews conducted when an artist would rather be silent. Recording sessions after long days. Appearances planned months in advance. And behind all of it is a strange psychological reality. Thousands of people may depend financially on the continued success of one recognizable face. Rihanna was still only in her late teens and early 20s. That fact is easy to forget. The world saw someone who appeared fearless. But she was learning adulthood while being observed by millions. She was discovering relationships while tabloids watched. She was making decisions while executives, managers, journalists, fans, and critics all had opinions about what Rihanna should become next. The difference between Robin and Rihanna must have been increasingly difficult to preserve. One was a person. The other was becoming an institution. And institutions are not allowed ordinary weaknesses. They are expected to keep producing. Keep smiling. Keep appearing. Keep selling. Keep winning. There is another strange feature of fame. Success can make the outside world assume that pain has disappeared. If someone is wealthy, famous, admired, and beautiful, people often imagine that person has somehow escaped ordinary human problems. But celebrity does not remove fear. Money does not guarantee healthy relationships. Awards cannot protect someone from private suffering. And public admiration does not necessarily tell us anything about what happens when the cameras are gone. By early 2009, Rihanna had reached a position many artists spend entire careers chasing. She had major international hits. She had awards. She had global recognition. She had become a fashion figure. And she was still only 20 years old. At the same time, her relationship with singer Chris Brown had become one of the most closely watched young celebrity relationships in entertainment. To fans, they looked almost perfectly matched. Both were young. Both were successful. Both were attractive. Both were everywhere. Photographs of them circulated constantly, and their relationship became part of the public story surrounding their careers. What the public could not see was everything happening behind those photographs. And then, on February 8, 2009, the carefully constructed image collapsed. Hours before the Grammy Awards, police responded to an incident involving Rihanna and Chris Brown. The details that later emerged were horrifying. Brown assaulted Rihanna during an argument inside a vehicle in Los Angeles. Police photographs showing Rihanna's injuries eventually circulated publicly, forcing one of the most painful moments of her life into the view of millions of strangers. The reaction was immediate. News programs discussed it. Tabloids covered it relentlessly. Fans were stunned. The entertainment world could talk about little else. Rihanna was suddenly no longer being discussed because of a hit song, an outfit, or an award. She had become the center of a domestic violence case. And once again, her private life belonged to the public. But there was something even more difficult waiting for her. She would eventually have to decide how to move forward while millions of people watched every decision. Some would support her. Some would judge her. Some would ask questions they had no right to ask. And some would blame the victim instead of the person who assaulted her. The young woman who had spent years building an image of confidence was about to face the most vulnerable chapter of her public life. And what happened next would permanently change the way the world saw Rihanna. The photographs were impossible to ignore. For years, Rihanna had been presented to the world as fearless, glamorous, and increasingly powerful. She was the woman behind Umbrella, the rising fashion icon, the young superstar who seemed capable of turning almost anything she touched into a cultural moment. Then, in February 2009, that image collided with something brutally real. The assault by Chris Brown did not remain a private trauma between two people. It became international news. Rihanna's injuries were photographed by police, and an image of her battered face was later leaked to the media. Suddenly, millions of strangers were staring at evidence from one of the darkest moments of her life. That created another kind of violation. It was no longer only about what had happened inside the car. Now the world could see it. People discussed her face on television. They debated her relationship. They analyzed what she should do next. Some asked why she had been with Brown. Others wondered whether she would return to him. The victim of an assault was being asked, directly and indirectly, to explain herself to an audience she had never invited into that moment. Chris Brown later pleaded guilty to felony assault and received probation, community labor, counseling requirements, and a restraining order. But a court judgment could not determine what Rihanna was supposed to feel afterward. And that was where the story became complicated. Because surviving something painful does not mean immediately knowing what to do next. Rihanna would later acknowledge that she briefly reconciled with Brown after the assault. That decision generated enormous public reaction. Some people were confused. Some were angry. Some criticized her. But Rihanna would eventually explain that her feelings had not simply disappeared because something terrible had happened. That reality is uncomfortable, but important. Abusive relationships can be emotionally complex. Love, fear, attachment, hope, shame, and confusion can exist at the same time. From outside a relationship, decisions can look obvious. From inside, they often are not. Rihanna eventually walked away. And when she began speaking publicly about what had happened, another version of her started emerging. Not someone untouched by pain. Someone determined not to let pain define the rest of her life. That distinction matters. Because the entertainment industry loves comeback stories, but real recovery is rarely as clean as a headline. There is no single morning when someone wakes up and everything is suddenly healed. There are memories. There are questions. There can be embarrassment over something that was never the victim's responsibility. There can also be anger at knowing that millions of strangers have seen something intensely personal. Rihanna had to navigate all of that while continuing one of the biggest careers in music. Later in 2009, she released Rated R. The difference was immediately noticeable. The sound was darker. The imagery was harder. The vulnerability felt closer to the surface. Songs such as Russian Roulette carried a tension unlike the carefree energy associated with some of her earlier work. It would be simplistic to claim that every lyric was a literal diary entry about what had happened. But there was no denying that the public was now hearing Rihanna differently. Something had changed. Her innocence, at least in the way the industry had marketed it, seemed gone. In its place was an artist who appeared more willing to explore anger, danger, sexuality, control, and emotional darkness. And then something remarkable happened. Rihanna did not disappear. Her career became even bigger. Over the following years came songs that seemed almost impossible to escape. Only Girl in the World. What's My Name? We Found Love. Diamonds. Stay. Work. Again and again, she reinvented herself. But there was a difference now. The public no longer saw only the girl discovered in Barbados. They had seen her survive something devastating. And Rihanna understood that her experience had consequences beyond celebrity gossip. When she later discussed the assault publicly, she spoke about recognizing the influence she could have on young women who might be experiencing similar situations. That may have been one of the heaviest parts of her fame. Her personal pain had become a public example. Millions were watching what she did next. But Rihanna refused to remain frozen in the role of victim. She kept creating. She changed her appearance whenever she wanted. She became increasingly outspoken. She pushed boundaries in music and fashion. And slowly, the narrative surrounding her shifted again. The question was no longer simply, what happened to Rihanna? It became, what will Rihanna do next? Yet survival did not mean her relationship with the past became simple. Years later, she would speak about forgiving Chris Brown and reaching a place where she no longer carried the same hatred toward him. That statement surprised some people. But forgiveness is not the same as denying what happened. And it does not erase accountability. For Rihanna, it appeared to represent her own way of refusing to remain emotionally trapped inside one terrible chapter. She was moving forward. And moving forward would eventually take her somewhere even more unexpected. Because after conquering pop music again and again, Rihanna began doing something that confused many fans. She slowed down. Then, after releasing ANTI in 2016, one of the biggest recording artists of her generation stopped releasing studio albums altogether. Years passed. Fans waited. Rumors exploded. And while everyone kept asking where Rihanna's next album was, she was quietly building something far larger than almost anyone had anticipated. Rihanna was preparing to prove that music was only one part of her empire. By 2016, Rihanna had already accomplished what most artists spend a lifetime trying to achieve. She had #1 singles, Grammy Awards, sold-out tours, global recognition, a catalog filled with songs that had become part of modern pop culture. Then came ANTI. The album felt different from much of what Rihanna had released before. It was moodier, stranger, less interested in delivering obvious radio formulas. Songs such as Work, Needed Me, Love on the Brain, and Kiss It Better showed an artist who seemed increasingly comfortable making decisions on her own terms. And then, something unexpected happened. Rihanna stopped releasing albums. At first, fans assumed the break would be temporary. A year passed. Then another. Then another. Every interview seemed to produce the same question. Where's the new album? The mysterious project eventually became known among fans simply as R9, a nickname for the hypothetical 9th studio album that seemed permanently close and permanently out of reach. Rumors appeared constantly. A reggae album was coming. Then perhaps 2 albums. Then maybe the project had been scrapped. Then Rihanna was supposedly recording again. Every small comment became a headline. Every photograph near a studio became evidence. Every social media joke became another clue. But the years continued passing. And something fascinating was happening during that silence. Rihanna had not disappeared. She had simply changed the battlefield. In 2017, she launched Fenty Beauty, a cosmetics brand that immediately attracted enormous attention. One of the reasons was simple. The brand entered the market emphasizing a much wider range of foundation shades than many mainstream beauty companies were offering at the time. For millions of consumers, especially women who had struggled to find products matching darker skin tones, the message felt significant. Rihanna was not merely placing her name on makeup. She was helping redefine expectations around inclusion in the beauty industry. The launch became a commercial success. Soon, Rihanna was being discussed not only as a singer, but as a serious entrepreneur. Then came Savage x Fenty. The lingerie brand emphasized a broad range of body types and turned its fashion presentations into celebrity-filled spectacles combining music, dance, fashion, and performance. Again, Rihanna seemed to understand something larger than the product itself. Representation had value. Consumers wanted to see themselves reflected. And Rihanna knew how to turn cultural instinct into business. Suddenly, the endless questions about music began sounding different. Why would someone who had spent years inside the exhausting machinery of pop stardom rush back into that machine when she had discovered entirely new forms of power? For the first time, Rihanna appeared able to decide exactly how much access the music industry would receive. She did not need another album to remain famous. She did not need another hit to prove that she belonged. She did not need to tour every year to stay financially successful. That freedom changed the relationship between Rihanna and her audience. Fans wanted music. Rihanna seemed determined to release it only when she believed the moment was right. And there was something almost rebellious about that choice. Pop stars are usually expected to keep moving. New single. New album. New tour. New interview. New era. Then repeat. The machinery rarely stops because an artist wants time to think. Rihanna stopped anyway. And rather than fading, she became even more culturally powerful. Her appearances became events precisely because they were no longer constant. A red carpet photograph could dominate fashion coverage. A short comment about new music could generate hundreds of headlines. Even her silence became part of her mythology. Then her priorities changed again. Motherhood entered the picture. Rihanna and A$AP Rocky welcomed their first child in 2022. A second son followed in 2023. Later, the couple welcomed a daughter, making Rihanna a mother of three. The woman who had once spent enormous stretches of her life moving from studios to stages to airports now had something entirely different demanding her attention. Family. And Rihanna made it increasingly clear that motherhood had changed how she viewed time. This mattered because celebrity culture often treats women as if they are required to continue producing at the same pace regardless of what happens in their personal lives. Fans asked for the album. Executives want the next campaign. Media outlets want appearances. But children do not care about release schedules. They care whether their mother is there. For Rihanna, that seemed to become more important than satisfying an industry timetable. It did not mean music was gone. She returned to major stages, including the Super Bowl halftime show in 2023, where she revealed her second pregnancy during the performance. The moment became one of the most discussed entertainment events of the year. But even that performance demonstrated something important. Rihanna could disappear from the traditional album cycle and still command one of the biggest stages in the world. She no longer had to chase relevance. Relevance appeared to wait for her. And that may be why the question, what happened to Rihanna, can be misleading. Nothing necessarily happened that destroyed her career. She changed what success meant. At 20, success meant hit records. At 30, it increasingly meant ownership, independence, business, family, and control over her own time. By 38, Rihanna had reached a position very few entertainers ever experience. She could say no. She could delay an album. She could disappear from public view. She could return when she wanted. But freedom has its own complications. Because the more Rihanna stepped away from traditional celebrity life, the more fascinated people became with the parts of her life she chose not to show. Her relationship, her children, her home, her future. And eventually, the woman who had spent years trying to control how much of herself the world could access would face a frightening reminder that fame does not always respect boundaries. The shooting incident in 2026 would make that painfully clear. But before that frightening moment, Rihanna experienced something else that may have changed her more profoundly than any chart record or business achievement ever could. She became a mother. And motherhood would bring her story full circle, all the way back to Barbados. For years, Rihanna's life had been defined by movement. Studios, airports, fashion shows, awards ceremonies, tour buses, hotel rooms, private jets, business meetings. There was always another city, another performance, another campaign, another deadline. Then motherhood changed the rhythm. When Rihanna welcomed her first child with A$AP Rocky in 2022, the transformation was not simply personal. It changed the way she spoke about work, ambition, and the future. For perhaps the first time since she was a teenager, Rihanna had a reason to measure success by something completely different from charts, sales, awards, or public attention. Someone needed her simply as a mother. Not Rihanna the superstar. Not Rihanna the businesswoman. Not Rihanna the fashion icon. Just her. That distinction became increasingly important as her family grew. A second son arrived in 2023. Later, Rihanna and A$AP Rocky welcomed a daughter, making them parents of 3 children. The public saw only carefully selected glimpses. A photograph here. A public appearance there. A family moment shared when Rihanna chose to share it. That control seemed deliberate. For a woman whose adulthood had been consumed by public curiosity, protecting her children represented a completely different responsibility. Rihanna had spent years learning what fame could take away. Privacy. Normality. Sometimes even a sense of safety. Now she had children who had never chosen fame for themselves. Their mother's name made them famous before they were old enough to understand what fame meant. And that created a difficult contradiction. Rihanna could give her children extraordinary opportunities, but she could not give them complete anonymity. Perhaps that is why her return to Barbados with her children carried so much emotional weight. For fans, Barbados is the beginning of Rihanna's story. But for Rihanna, it is not a chapter in a celebrity biography. It is home. It is where Robin existed before the world knew Rihanna. The streets there contain memories from before the cameras. Before Def Jam. Before Umbrella. Before the Grammys. Before Fenty Beauty. Before anyone outside Barbados had a reason to recognize her face. Years after leaving as a teenager with an uncertain future, Rihanna returned as one of the most recognizable women in the world. This time, she was not alone. She brought her children. Think about the distance between those 2 versions of her life. A young girl once walked through those streets without knowing whether music would ever take her anywhere. Now her name is permanently connected to the place where she grew up. The street where her childhood home stands was officially renamed Rihanna Drive in 2017. That alone would have seemed unimaginable to the teenage Robin Fenty. But returning there with her own children made the symbolism even more powerful. It was not simply a celebrity visiting her hometown. It was a mother showing her children where everything began. Before wealth. Before fame. Before the world decided who Rihanna was supposed to be. There was the island. There was family. There was home. And perhaps motherhood made those beginnings matter differently. Success often pushes people forward. Motherhood can force them to look backward. What did my parents give me? What hurt me? What do I want my children to experience differently? What parts of my childhood do I want them to understand? For Rihanna, those questions must exist alongside circumstances almost no ordinary parent faces. Her children are growing up around enormous privilege. But their mother knows personally that money does not eliminate every form of difficulty. She also knows that family relationships can leave complicated memories. Rihanna has spoken openly over the years about the instability she witnessed growing up and about the problems that affected her father. Those experiences belonged to Robin long before Rihanna became powerful enough to control companies and headlines. Motherhood gave her an opportunity to create something new. A different environment. A different family rhythm. A different childhood for the next generation. And then there was A$AP Rocky. Their relationship had developed publicly, but unlike some of Rihanna's earlier romances, the dynamic increasingly appeared centered around family. They attended events together. They supported each other's careers. They became parents together. Rocky has spoken enthusiastically about fatherhood, while Rihanna has repeatedly made clear how deeply motherhood has reshaped her priorities. The image was striking. The same woman whose early romantic life had once become associated with one of the most painful celebrity stories of the late 2000s had reached a completely different chapter. She had not stopped loving. She had not allowed the past to dictate every relationship that followed. She had built a family. And this is where Rihanna's story becomes more emotional than the sensational headlines surrounding her. The heartbreaking element is not that Rihanna lost everything. She did not. It is that the woman seen smiling beside her children had traveled through experiences that could easily have changed the direction of her life permanently. A turbulent childhood. Extreme fame while still young. Public humiliation. Domestic violence. Relentless media attention. Years of pressure to keep producing. And later, the frightening reality that even a family home could attract unwanted danger. Yet at 38, Rihanna was still moving forward. Not at the speed fans demanded. At her own speed. That may be the most important difference between the teenage girl who entered the music industry and the woman she became. Young Rihanna had to seize every opportunity before it disappeared. Rihanna at 38 had earned the power to choose. Choose when to work. Choose when to perform. Choose when to release music. Choose when to disappear. And, most importantly, choose what parts of herself belonged only to her family. But there was still one question left. After everything Rihanna had survived and everything she had built, what had actually happened to her by the age of 38? The answer is far more complicated than any tragic headline suggests. Because Rihanna's story is not really about a woman who was destroyed by fame. It is about a woman who eventually learned how to stop fame from owning her. So what really happened to Rihanna at 38? The answer is not what a sensational headline might make people believe. She did not simply disappear. She did not lose everything. She did not become a forgotten star watching the world move on without her. Instead, Rihanna reached a stage of life that may be more difficult to explain than any dramatic rise or sudden collapse. She changed. And perhaps the world had difficulty accepting that change because people had spent so many years expecting Rihanna to remain exactly what they wanted her to be. A hitmaker. A fashion icon. A performer. A headline. A source of endless entertainment. But Rihanna had spent nearly her entire adult life giving pieces of herself to the public. By 38, she appeared increasingly determined to decide which pieces would remain private. That is why the long wait for another album became symbolic of something larger. Fans kept asking for music. Rihanna kept living. She became a mother. She built businesses. She created a family with A$AP Rocky. She returned to Barbados. She continued appearing publicly when she chose. And behind all of it was a woman whose relationship with fame had become radically different from the teenager who once needed every opportunity she could get. At 17, Rihanna needed the music industry. At 38, the music industry needed Rihanna. That reversal is extraordinary. But power does not erase vulnerability. The frightening 2026 incident involving gunfire at the property where Rihanna and her family were staying demonstrated that clearly. No amount of money can guarantee that strangers will respect boundaries. No amount of security can make celebrity completely safe. And no level of influence can return the anonymity Rihanna surrendered almost 2 decades earlier. That may be the hidden cost behind the story. Imagine knowing that your children may be photographed because of who their mother is. Imagine knowing that strangers discuss your relationship as though they are participants in it. Imagine walking into a restaurant and immediately becoming the most watched person in the room. Imagine millions of people demanding explanations every time you disappear for a few months. Most people experience privacy without realizing how valuable it is. Rihanna lives in a world where privacy can become a luxury more difficult to obtain than almost anything money can buy. And yet, the woman who emerged from those pressures does not resemble someone defeated by them. Look at the arc of the story. A girl grows up in Barbados inside a complicated family environment. Music gives her an escape. A producer hears her sing. She travels to America. She auditions. She signs a record deal. Within a few years, the entire world knows her name. Then fame becomes darker. At 20, she survives an assault that becomes international news. Photographs from one of the worst moments of her life are exposed publicly. People judge her decisions. Millions debate her relationships. She could have disappeared. Instead, she releases more music. She becomes bigger. Then, after conquering pop music, she does something even more unexpected. She stops following the traditional rules. She builds Fenty Beauty. She expands into fashion. She becomes a business force. She slows down musically. She becomes a mother. And eventually, she begins protecting time rather than chasing attention. That is the Rihanna people see at 38. Not someone standing at the end of her story. Someone who appears to have realized that she does not owe the world every chapter. There is something almost poetic about her returning to Barbados with her children. Decades earlier, Robin Fenty left the island carrying ambition and uncertainty. She did not know if she would become famous. She did not know whether people would buy her music. She certainly could not have imagined that one day the road associated with her childhood would carry her name. Yet fame ultimately brought her back to the same place with a completely different understanding of what mattered. Perhaps that is the most emotional part. The world spent years watching Rihanna become larger than life. But motherhood may have reminded her that life itself was larger than Rihanna. Larger than album sales. Larger than magazine covers. Larger than awards. Larger even than the expectations of millions of fans. There are children now. There is family. There is home. And there is time. Something Rihanna surrendered in enormous quantities during the years when her career moved relentlessly forward. So when people ask, what happened to Rihanna? Maybe the better question is, what did Rihanna learn? She learned that fame can disappear as quickly as it arrives. She learned that love can sometimes become painful. She learned that surviving something does not require pretending it never happened. She learned that success means very little without control over your own life. And she learned that there are things more valuable than constantly remaining visible. That does not mean her story is finished. Far from it. The fascination surrounding her music proves how much audiences still care about what she might do next. Another album could come. Another performance could dominate the world. Another business could appear. Rihanna has reached the unusual position where almost anything she does becomes news precisely because she no longer does everything. But perhaps whatever comes next matters less than what she has already achieved. Because Fenty did more than become Rihanna. She survived becoming Rihanna. She survived the pressure attached to the name. She survived the moments when her private pain became public entertainment. She survived being underestimated, overexposed, analyzed, criticized, and endlessly demanded from. And at 38, she is still here. Still creating. Still evolving. Still protecting the people she loves. And still reminding the world that sometimes the most powerful thing a superstar can do is stop performing for everyone else and finally start living for herself.